Welcome back. Thanks so much for joining us for another episode. We're going to be talking today about inhibitors to remediation, because maybe we want to remediate something and something is getting in the way and we can't get it done. So we're going to talk about a couple different examples, right?
Definitely, because there are a few that can hinder your ability to remediate the vulnerabilities that you need just because you have a report, right? You say, well, I got this report. You're paying me to tell you what my findings are. I've found them. Here they are. Here's my justification, right? We talk about the reasoning, why you want to implement maybe a control or you want to implement a patch, right? Well, there are a few things that can happen, and a couple of things are contractual agreements, right? It could be something like an SLA, a service level agreement, or a memorandum of understanding. Let's start with that one. When we talk about a memorandum of understanding, right, what we're talking about is something that isn't legally binding, right? We talk about maybe an agreement between two companies. I was joking around with Sophia. I said, it's not like a BPA where it's a business partner agreement, which we could put that up there as well, too, and say, hey, we've got two business partners. We need to implement a fix to a vulnerability, and it's going to degrade their services. They might not appreciate that, right? So the memorandum of understanding, again, the creation of these agreements should always include security. That's very, very important, as well to avoid or include the language for vulnerability management. And that's one of the things that I really want to stress. I already mentioned kind of another contractual agreement too, service level agreements. Remember that the service level agreements just define the responsibilities for each party, right? A lot of times what we talk about is that it is a service provider. Whatever the service might be. Don't think of just internet service provider or cloud service provider. Somebody providing a service, right? There is a contract of the acceptable level of performance that service provided should be established and given to the customer, right? And if I have to implement some kind of fix that, let's say, is going to bring that server offline or wherever in your digital ecosystem that information resides that customer needs access to, they're not going to gain access to it. Maybe they don't have the uptime that you told them they would have. Well, that might be something that inhibits the remediation because you have a contractual agreement to provide a certain service level. And if you don't provide that service level, now you have some kind of fine or fee or liability for it.
And SLAs and MOUs are both types of agreements, right?
They are.
But then on a different side of this, I don't know, dice coin, whatever you want to call it, you might also deal with like pushback from leadership, right? If you want to implement a fix and they're like, no, you can't do that.
That's right. And that's what I'm just generically calling organizational governance, right? When we talk about that, think about, at the end of the day, our C-level executives, right? They look at the overall arching business. Where are we going? Where are we moving? How do we get there? Are we where we need to be? Are we seeing the increase? What is the that profit and loss margin, right? What do the books say? All right. Well, we need to implement this fix, and it's on a major system. And unfortunately, what it's going to do is it's going to bring it offline for about an hour and a half. We are going to see some performance degradation, let's say within a productivity suite inside of the company. And they say, no, we can't really afford that right now. We're going to have to wait. Right now, it's not a good time. You might get some kickback from there too. The other thing to keep in mind too is that the overall process from beginning to end, from detection of a vulnerability to the determination, classification, and prioritization of how we implement, that's very long. So another thing that you might get pushback from is when you go and you say, hey, we need to implement this patch. How long is it going to take? Well, it's going to take a couple of weeks. Well, we just can't afford that right now. So again, you might get that pushback from that way, from there too. Compensating controls might be required, right? And what do I mean? Compensating controls is kind of like a workaround. If a control that you say you need to implement is going to violate a policy, you might have to work around with a compensating control. So that's another thing to keep in mind too. You might come with a proposal to implement a control, some kind of countermeasure that counters this vulnerability, or the threat of that vulnerability being realized. And unfortunately, you're not allowed to. So let me give you an example, right? We need to plug this system into the network in order to do patch updates, right? No, this is an air gap system. You are not allowed to connect that system to our production network. It needs to stay isolated in its own environment on its own VLAN. And the only way you can do patch management is to download it to a thumb drive and sneaker net it over to the computer and plug it in manually, right? So compensating controls might have to happen because the one that you propose might not be something that they can implement. So think about that too. Again, the other thing too is that the remediation process itself, making sure that I tell you this, It might. Does it lower the security posture of your organization? Right? Well, so you think about that. You've probably seen a movie before where they're like, hey, we need to implement this critical fix right now. And they're like, well, if we do, we got to pull life support for about 20 seconds. Well, if whatever your control is might potentially reduce the security, you might have a CISO that says, no, we can't afford to do that. We're going to have to find another method. So you can see there are some times where you get pushback. You have the best of intentions, but unfortunately, it's not the right circumstances in order to implement it.
In an instance like what you just said, you would have to decide, is it worth it, right? Like what, if we're implementing this patch to increase security, but in order to implement it, we've got to decrease security over here, like you've got to decide if it's worth it, right?
It does, and that's the part of that whole configuration management and patch management, right? What is the if I do this or if I don't do this? What is the effect if I do? What is the cost if I don't? So again, that comes back to prioritization as well too. Other things that I would keep in mind, and we've really already mentioned this, is degraded functionality. We talk about degraded functionality. If a system is going to reduce the performance levels that are acceptable and what's expected, have we violated the SLA? Have we violated the MOU or a business partner agreement? Have you violated something like an inter-site topology agreement? So for instance, maybe you're a bank and you're a mortgage company. You want to look at the mortgages that are currently in that, in that list. You fill out a non-disclosure agreement and you come into a contractual agreement of how you're going to connect your two networks together, and you say, hey, I found a vulnerability. Well, does that break that agreement? No, we don't. You can't be connected to our network. Yeah. So there are many things that we have to worry about. Degraded functionality is another one. Last but not least, I'll leave you with this: legacy system. Legacy systems are always something that presents a challenge to patch management. And that's because they're typically out of their life cycle, right? You have a finite amount of time that a company will support a product, right? Because if they supported it indefinitely, well, they would probably go out of business because they'd only need to make one product and never make any new ones. But the point being is that all technology has a certain life cycle. When it gets to the end of that life cycle, the vendor no longer supports it. They're not creating patches for it. And at this point, those systems also become an inhibitor to remediation, because how do you remediate something that doesn't have a patch? A security flaw is found in it, but nobody is creating patches in order to fix these. That could be that air-gapped system that I tell you about. Why is it air-gapped? Well, because we can't patch it, right? Well, we need to do something to it, right? Well, again, all of these kind of can really just link themselves together, and there are many more out there, but these are some of the common ones that can really slow down the process of vulnerability management. Remember that it's up to you to provide the reasoning in the report so that hopefully you can overcome some of these things that might run detrimental to your remediation cycle.
Absolutely. Like you said, hopefully you can overcome it. If you can't, it sounds like some of this might be things where it's like you just got to deal with it. Like, sorry, we can't implement that patch. It's just we don't have the facilities for that right now. So hopefully you don't run into that. Hopefully you're able to get through it just fine. But it's still good to be aware of some of these inhibitors to remediation so that if you do encounter them, you know what to do. So thank you for walking us through this, Wes. And thank you so much for joining us for this episode. We'll see you next time.